Firstly, I want to thank you for the analysis you have done. It did provide us, and I know the Chair will agree with this and others who are in Washington, it provided us with really valuable material to be able to communicate to them exactly what was going on. And as you said, I think what the important point was that you have the British government and their envoys in America trying to convince people that they are trying to defend the Good Friday Agreement and have better outcomes for victims and survivors, which obviously is a lie, and we might as well call it that. I think nobody is being fooled, but I do think it's important. And I think what was good about the trip to Washington, I suppose, because it was cross-party, and it was the first time that this joint Oireachtas committee had visited Washington, and we were able to address some of the lies that had been told in relation to this legislation and what it might do. Because at the end of the day, it is an insult to the intelligence of all of the political parties and the Irish government, and indeed European states as well, in terms of what is trying to be achieved here. And I think it's an important point that you say that this isn't put forward by all veterans. It is by an element within it to keep things closed and to keep the lid on things, because God forbid the people across this island or other islands or around the world would see exactly what happened. So we can see very clearly in terms of the attempts to control the narrative there. And I think it's just appalling, never mind the unilateral actions of them. So I want to ask you a couple of questions around it. So is this unprecedented in the last quarter of a century since the Good Friday Agreement in terms of what it seeks to do, and in terms of it having no due process as was laid out? So that is one question. The other one I just want to ask you to elaborate on, where you say that the processes are actually working too well in terms of information, again, that was coming out, and I know some of us here have gone up, attended the Ballymurphy inquiry there. Have you come across anybody in all of your presentations and different things who thought that this legislation was a good idea, or was the right thing to do? And just maybe if you could give us an idea of the timeline around taking an interstate case to the European Court of Human Rights. But thank you very much.
Can I just say, I think Michelle, the clerk informs me, want to come in. Michelle, I don't know if she doesn't know Chris.
Chris is next, yeah.
You go ahead, yeah. No, whatever, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, I was told Michelle might want to come in. Okay. Michelle, can you hear us? If she'll start, I'll go back to you then. Apologies, it's just...
She's just trying to connect into the meeting
rather
than make the contribution.
Sorry,
Chris is the
apologies, okay.
In relation to the first question, is this unprecedented? The simple answer is yes. In the various paperwork that comes along with the bill, including the human rights memorandum that includes the bill, makes reference to a number of things that have happened during the peace process. And so, for example, the early release of politically motivated prisoners, that's referenced, the process for the disappeared and the recovery of bodies, and the process for the decommissioning of weapons. But none of them are that relevant to what is being attempted here. So first of all, in terms of the early release of prisoners, as committee members will be aware, people had already been tried and convicted and served a sentence. Now, it is true that people were all released within 2 years of the agreement being signed, but in this context, you're talking about getting rid of investigations, getting rid of prosecutions, and no jail time. Actually, in previous efforts, we have worked very hard to try to come up with pragmatic solutions. And so, working with the British Army and a range of other stakeholders, we came up with what we thought was a workable solution, whereby, for example, you could have continued to have investigations and prosecutions, but reduce jail time to 0. Because if there is a genuine concern, and I'm sure there is a genuine concern at some level about elderly veterans going to jail in their 70s or 80s, and what's the purpose of that, and so forth. And in doing that piece of work, we discovered that the Secretary of State already has the power within the Northern Ireland Sentences Act to reduce the 2-year maximum to 0. That can be done now. like that could be done. So it's not about keeping elderly veterans out of jail. It's about not having public trials and not having proper investigations. The disappeared process, obviously evidence could not be used relating to information that was given over from primarily the IRA to that commission. But if other evidence emerged from somewhere else, not that process, people were still liable to prosecution. And similarly, the decommissioning. So what you've had narrow versions of immunity to achieve particular objectives, and that's what happened in the disappeared process. But it wasn't an amnesty. It didn't get rid of prosecutions. If evidence came from somewhere else, then it could be used. And the really frustrating bit for us, I suppose, is having worked on this for all of the years, and I stress our frustration is at nothing compared to victims who've been waiting for 50 years for this stuff. But as people who've put a significant amount of time and energy, is that there was a workable solution through all of this. There was a bilateral approach with the Irish government, keeping the local parties on board, perhaps even getting to a stage where if you'd reduced the jail time to 0 to deal with the veterans issue, there would only be a small number of prosecutions anyway, but victims would have still have had their day in court. So when you come up with lawful and politically pragmatic ways of getting it done, it's very frustrating, that pathway isn't taken, because it was there for the asking. It could have been done. So yes, it's unprecedented. It's a unilateral act on the part of the British government. It was not workable, and in our view, it is unlawful.
So in terms of the issue of how well the current mechanisms are working, so the current mechanisms came from the cases that were taken to the European Court of Human Rights, that things weren't meeting the investigative standards, so there were changes to the inquest system, police ombudsman, call-in of independent police teams, things like that, to try and progress human rights complaint investigations. As we know, there's been huge amounts of obstruction of those bodies over the years. I mean, most recently it was the blocking of funding for things like legacy inquests and the police ombudsman's office, but also what's sometimes called the slow waltz of state disclosure, where documents and control of the Ministry of Defence and other agencies aren't disclosed. But we've got to a stage whereby the relentless work by families and their representatives has managed to overcome a lot of those barriers, and we're seeing delivery of the existing mechanisms at the moment like never before. So we have hundreds and hundreds of pages this year. I mean, 600 pages in the 2 biggest reports alone, but there's more than that, from the Police Ombudsman's Office, that have delivered significant truth recovery with teeth, because there's proper powers there, in reports like Operation Greenwich, Operation Achilles, and historical clarification in relation to patterns and practices of police collusion with loyalist paramilitaries in different areas. There's also, of course, the inquest system, which is also beginning to deliver. There was the Thompson inquest last week. There was obviously the Ballymurphy inquest before that as well, that has broken down what were decades of an official truth that simply wasn't true, and provided considerable historical clarification at the very least. You also have Operation Canova and the other operations under the auspices of former Chief Constable John Boucher that have amassed, again, using information recovery with teeth, full police powers, over 50,000 pages of evidence. Now, no one other than possibly the British government's command paper, well, definitely the British government's command paper, no one else ever pretended that all of these mechanisms were about prosecutions. Everyone knew there were going to be prosecutions were going to be full and far between for reasons that don't need to be rehearsed here, that really they were about information recovery with teeth. And it is at this very juncture, when they are now finally overcoming those obstacles and beginning to deliver, that the drawbridge is about to be pulled up, and that's profoundly concerning. In relation to your other question about who supports this, I'm struggling to pin down the names of groups. I mean, the groups that have come out in support of it tend to be those that represent some military veterans and some police officers, but by former police officers, but by no means all.
Well, and I think just on that point, on the former police officers, the George Cross, which represents former RAC officers, have come out strongly against it, and so there is a diversity of views across people who serve both in the security forces that is not often represented in the ways in which British ministers speak. Can I just pick up on one point that Daniel made there around, I suppose, having studied this for a long time and worked on it for a long time, one of the things that becomes clear is that it is precisely, it's a judge doing their job properly or a police officer doing their job properly, using their respective powers, that's the fear that is driving this bill. Actually, it's where you if people have proper legal powers and do their job properly in terms of investigating the past via an inquest or via the police ombudsman's office, or indeed via work of John Boucher, good people with proper powers, proper police powers, proper investigative powers, proper powers of inquest. That's the problem. That's the problem, and that's why I had a meeting with a senior official in the Northern Ireland office when the evening the bill came out, and I get on very well with this particular individual. But I said to him, it looks to me like what you've done here in terms of is that you've done a search, find, and replace for the word investigation with the word review. So there's a 2018 version of the bill that was produced to implement the Stormont House Agreement. And so I said, is that what you've done here? You've literally done a search, find and replace throughout the bill, right down the spine of the bill every time. So in the previous version of the bill, there's a lot of discussion around Article 2 compliant investigations, independent, effective, and so on. Investigation. It's literally search, find and replace, all with the word review. And so it does exactly what it says on the tin. And the frustration bit is that there was a workable solution with all of this. It could have been done.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for the presentation, and I concur with much of what has been said previously. And I suppose the first point I want to make is I think it's a really important part about the narrative that's developed, and I think that we can wrongfully think that this is just the Tory right who's driving this. I think there's elements across the entire British political system who have bought into this idea and accept this narrative that the witch trials and all the rest of it, and I think that is an important point. I think there is a role for the Dublin government. But I also want to pick up on the point too about the authoritarian regimes around the world licking their lips to this. And it used to be the case that those same regimes in similar places used to be very envious of the Special Powers Act and various clauses in the Special Powers Act, and I've no doubt they're going to look at this now. So then where does the United Nations maybe come in, especially with regards to the fact that Dublin, the Irish government have a seat at the Security Council? Is there a role for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights? Is there the opportunity even for the periodic reviews to look at some of this stuff? Does that help put it into an arena that again helps? Because you're right, I think the Council of Ministers and the state case in Europe is going to be the obvious place. But what role maybe does the United Nations play in this?
I think all of the above, Chris. I think, so as you know, the UN Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice carried out a visit to Northern Ireland in 2014-15. His successor, and was quite critical at that stage of what was going on, his successor issued a very strong critique of the command paper, and we obviously have sent our materials to him again and said, this is the new version of the legislation, and one would expect the Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice to come back as well. And he has serious misgivings on the use of amnesties per se, and so I would expect the UN to be issuing something critical fairly soon on it as well.
And the UK is up for its universal periodic review in September, October of this year, where other member states could certainly press these issues, and it hopefully will be an issue on the agenda, but not least because of the concerns that the Special Rapporteur has already raised that this is a flagrant breach, quote unquote, of the UK's international obligations.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay.